Nonsense. That's the word we heard in our Bible reading today about what those male apostles thought of what the women had said. The Greek word is leiros, used nowhere else in Scripture, and nonsense is kind of the nice translation of it. It's more like garbage, drivel, crap, or worse, you know. I'm not going to say it, but you know what I mean. They couldn't believe what the women had said, and they said, garbage, it's nonsense what you were saying. I imagine they thought the dead are supposed to stay dead. No one can imagine that a dead person can come back to life, right? It's hard to believe this miraculous story, isn't it? It was for those first disciples. Now, I won't ask for a show of hands, but maybe some of us today find it hard to believe. Or we believe the story, but we're not really sure why it matters for our lives or what difference it makes. Now, if I were asking for hands, I might raise my hand too sometimes. Because it's hard to believe. It's not supposed to be easy to believe. It's hard to know how Jesus coming back to life affects our lives. I mean, those I've loved who have died haven't come back to life. So this old story, I wouldn't call it nonsense the way the disciples do, but truthfully, some days, I just don't know what to make of it. Maybe you too. And as I said, it turns out we're in good company of those who struggle to believe or struggle to have faith and hope. Those male disciples didn't believe it either. They said it was garbage, nonsense. And of course, they were dismissive. They had to see it for themselves. So Peter ran to the tomb and found it empty, and he still didn't get the full meaning of what he saw. He came back wondering, it says. And the story of resurrection keeps unfolding from there. A strange beginning, I think, that Jesus didn't come back with pomp and circumstance. The news didn't ring out from the street corners. Instead, it all began with confusion and disbelief and uncertainty. And yet, the story goes on. You see, no matter where we are in our lives, whether we're skeptical or not, whether we're interested or not, God's love and God's new life find us anyway. What can look like nonsense or just nothing at all can turn into something much, much more. God's work is often in nonsense. The foolishness of the cross, Paul says. God works in nonsense, in nothingness, in smallness, and somehow something happens. I'm a gardener, and one thing that amazes me is our seeds. Have you ever thought about this? Maybe I'm just an overthinker, but seeds are these tiny little things. And somehow, in such a small space, is the blueprint for the life of a whole plant. And if you put them in the right conditions, with dirt and water and sun, from a speck, some so tiny you can hardly even see them, grows a whole plant. It's kind of like Jesus' story about the mustard seed. Mustard seeds are teensy-weensy, and from them grows a whole tree. Out of nothing, out of garbage, out of nonsense can come wonder and life. Once, when I was in high school, there was a tragic death in my family, and I don't remember much about the days afterward, but I remember one thing. My Girl Scout troop leader, who I had known for half my life at that point, and who was the kind of woman who cared deeply about us, but didn't use words for it. She showed up at my family's house with toilet paper and paper towels. It was an interesting gift, but very practical and very useful. And in that toilet paper, I knew that she loved us, and that was her way of showing it. I wouldn't have thought of that toilet paper as being God's work necessarily, but I remember her showing up with it now, almost 20 years later, and I'll remember that for the rest of my life. It was an ordinary act, a small thing like a seed, but it held the weight of her great love. It's hard to believe in love. It's hard to believe in miracles. It's hard to put faith in small beginnings and what looks like nothing or nonsense, but that is where God works so often. Small and quiet, like in a manger where Jesus was born in a nowhere town to nowhere parents. Small and quiet at the tomb when no one was around. Friends, if you need hope that your life can be different or that this world can hold more love than hate or violence, hold on and maybe look in the nonsense places, the dark places, and find those small seeds. An 8-year-old named Wendy, back in the 70s, was traveling from her home in North Dakota to Vermont, and no one in her family could go with her, so they sent her with a 19-year-old family friend. In Chicago, their connecting flight got canceled, and God bless this 19-year-old for making a huge mistake, but she left the 18-year-old in the Chicago airport. The 8-year-old was alone, scared, didn't know what to do. She sat there, wondering and waiting, and a woman noticed her, asked her where she was going, where her parents were. They proceeded to call the parents to check in, and then this woman, who wasn't going to Vermont at all, but to Pittsburgh or somewhere, went with the 8-year-old to Vermont and then continued on her journey. The 8-year-old will and has forever remembered the kindness of that woman, a kind of kindness that some might say is hard to believe in, that people can be that good and that loving. But she was. It happens. Out of small nothings, small acts, the tiniest acts of paying attention to each other, love grows, and there is God. So what would happen if we began to wonder about the supposed nonsense around us? What if we ran to the places where we thought life was over and waited for the seeds of new life to unfurl around us? It's hard to believe, isn't it? But there's always more than we can see. That's the good news of Easter, that life never ends and love never dies. God's love and life find us anyway, whether we're ready for it or not. So look around, wonder like Peter. God is making all things new, even us, even you. Out of garbage, new life begins.